Council, Twaweza, the Ministry, and everybody else who's here. Good morning. Thank you very much for this invitation to do this. So I'm going to help us think through what I have called decolonization and cultural heritage in Africa, prospects and bottlenecks, okay? I may not cover all of them, but I'll highlight a few. Let's start with actually where Mwehaki had taken us. What's in a name? Allow me to start with a little family history to help me make a fine point about decolonization and heritage. And my understanding, and I think our understanding, our shared understanding here about decolonization is that it is the work of unlearning, unpacking the rules and hierarchies erected by colonial order. And so how do we link that to the question of cultural heritage and how we are going to help our culture grow? Like I said, I'll start with a little family story. In 1931 or 1932, when my father-in-law was born, he was a rather sickly infant. His mother, Kerubo, decided to mute the child's ethnic name and instead give him an English name. She called him Alex after some white man in the vicinity. Not Alexander, just Alex. Kerubo's reasoning was that whenever somebody called out the child's foreign name to exclaim at how frail the baby looked, the local gods would walk past, disinterested in someone that belonged to some other place. By situating the child outside the local culture through that foreign name, this child would, ironically, be protected by the very norms of that local culture. The ethnic culture found another creative way to cling on to that child. The people, in the ingenuity that is sometimes dismissed as mother tongue interference, turned the name Alex into Arigisi. Kerubo's calculation worked. The child began to thrive. Arigisi, as he's still called by those from his birthplace where he hasn't lived for over 70 years now, is 90 years old. The local gods spared him. Perhaps they even looked on benignly and showered his uniqueness with an abundance of life. Now, there are several lessons in this story about heritage and decolonization. One, the things of Western culture were not always violently thrust and imposed upon us, the colonized. Occasionally, the colonized chose some things, some of those things. They calculated, they edited, they picked what would serve a local good. Two, the root of Kerubo's gamble is faith in a deity who teaches us the value of fairness, of picking only that which belongs to you, or that which will not harm the other side. Remember, Arigisi was not called Alexander, which was the full name. It was curtailed to Alex, so that you don't harm the other side as you borrow and pick. You take enough and leave something. Now, the third thing I think that we learn here, and which is especially important for us at this gathering, is the fine point that decolonization has always been staged beyond the arena of our national politics of representation and governance. Put differently, in the quotidian, everyday politics of life, there are many acts of defiance, of subversion, and protest that have contributed overall to the process of decolonization. Too often, when we think of this work of freeing colonized nations, ideologically and otherwise, we wear the lens of the nation state. And so we see the big names, the big moments, the big actions, the Dedan Kimadis, and so on. We forget the everyday cultural work that has been done by the Kerubos of this country to guard their own and to subvert colonial order. The name Alex was not adopted because it marked a desire to abandon ethnic norms and embrace Western culture. Kerubo chose that Western name because it allowed her to placate her own gods. What I also gleaned from that life story about decolonization is that the work of unlearning and unpacking is not limited to outright rejection and overthrowing. Let's think a little now about method. You know, the local gods speak in the moment when they reject that which has come from elsewhere. But there is that other equally important moment when Kerubo and the others in her midst repurpose Alex into Arigisi to give it local flavor, okay, if you like, so that it can continue serving their needs by fitting into their language and their mores. This secondary act of submerging the alien name into the local environment, that act of dunking, is a moment of embrace that also envelopes the child, who ends up enjoying a long and rewarding life. So when we think of decolonization, let's not just talk about rejecting. Let's also talk about how we adopt, borrow, submerge, and use within. Stories like this one of Arigisi remind us of the value of indigenous knowledge and the fact that it may not be as remote as we often imagine it to be. I fear sometimes that in our conversations about indigenous knowledge, we think of it as a long time ago. You know, and actually, if you think 1970 is 50 years ago, and even the knowledge of 1970 sometimes is so removed from us. What was the local knowledge then, and how can we use it today? So we also, I think, need to think about the recent past and see it as part of cultural heritage. Now, what stories like those need is volume and visibility so that they can help us reestablish other ways of confronting the challenges and the realities of a post-colonial nation. And I think that too often we draw a very fine line between the old ways and the imposed ways without looking at what lies in between. I'm a big advocate of hybridity, of cultural hybridity. Now, what else do we find in stories generally? If the stories of cultural decolonization in our midst need amplification for decolonization to be fully effected, the story of colonialism itself, I think, needs volume and visibility in the so-called mother countries, the home of the colonizer. What are these countries doing to make the stories of what they did in Africa known in their own midst? And not just known, but most importantly, told also from the point of view of the colonized. Now, I say this because in the spring of 2005, I spent a semester at the Center for West African Studies at the University of Birmingham. As a research fellow, I was attending postgraduate seminars to develop a publication, but I was also having tutorial encounters with the undergraduates. The first time that an undergraduate asked me why I, being from Kenya, spoke English, I didn't know what to do with that question. In the course of that Birmingham semester, that question popped up many times. Eventually, I framed an answer that was sufficiently enlightening and studiously polite, but only because I had realized that that question was rooted in a deep ignorance of colonial history. I took the time to look at the GCSE history syllabus. I took the time to look at the IGCSE history syllabus, the O-level syllabus, as well as the AS and the A-level. And I understood how a humanities undergraduate could have arrived at the assumption that Britain only colonized India. A few students knew about Nigeria from their encounters with international students, but most students only knew about the colonization of India, and that really bothered me. I mean, it's one thing to have occupied these lands, turned some like ours into settler colonies where all local ways were denigrated and shunned as the extraction of numerous resources fed the coffers of Britain. I think it's quite another matter, 60, 70 years later, to expunge the history of colonialism from the British school curriculum. Now, I won't even dwell on the fact that the I in IGCSE stands for international, so that jaundiced history is learned in that curated form in many developing nations, including ours. My real focus is on England itself. You just can't do that. You cannot keep your learners away from the work that your ancestors did in Africa. Not only does such ellipsis and erasure run the danger of the whole imperial misadventure being reenacted in future, but equally important in the present, that erasure creates numerous uncomfortable conversations, such as those that I heard in Birmingham in 2005, and which I've had many other times since. I think worse still, these calculated erasures, with their attendant language of masking and distracting, legitimize national policies of exclusion. If those in your midst don't know that you colonized others, if they don't know that you took their lands, their natural resources, their ideas, things, and people, and if they don't hear it from those who you colonized, how will they join the conversation on returning what was taken and support policies for restitution and repatriation? How will they participate in the wider project of inclusive growth? Decolonization in Africa means undoing a misguided adherence to Western regimes of knowledge and believing once again in the value of local knowledge systems and things. For the colonizer, I think, decolonization means recognizing the humanity of those who are colonized. Decolonization is the framework through which what was taken must be returned. And part of what both the colonizer and the former colonies must unpack is a culture of scholarship that is blind and deaf to Africa's regimes of knowledge. What sustained the colonial project in Africa were universities and centers that focused on the study of Africa and they erected expertise about Africa and Africans. This knowledge was taught to British administrators as they started their careers as colonial officers in Africa, and they, in turn, once they had lived here, generated monographs, reports, life stories that have furthered Africanist discourse, for decades. Now, over the years, as Britain has joined the decolonization conversation, these old practices of knowledge production are still in place. I recall traveling to England in the winter of 2018 at the invitation of the Center for African Studies at Cambridge University. I was to give 2 lectures at Cambridge and 1 at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. Now, 2 of these lectures were canceled, the one at SOAS and one of the ones at Cambridge, because of a student-led movement to decolonize the university and the curriculum. And the faculty joined in what were called teach-outs. I didn't mind some of the free time I got because my lectures were canceled, but I also decided to join in what was going on. So I had the benefit of attending one of the seminars that was set up to debate the protocols of decolonization at Cambridge. What struck me was not the call for more black and brown writers in the curriculum. What struck me was the reluctance to look elsewhere, to countries where concrete steps in decolonizing the mind had long taken root. Think of the work that went on here at the University of Nairobi in 1969, turning what was called the English department into the Department of Literature, okay? Those were clear protocols for how do you change a curriculum so that it reckons with the existence of the other and the cultural experience of the other. It's not just about black and brown writers. It's actually about method. It's about genres. It's about methods of inquiry. And so, you expand actually beyond English, beyond literature, you actually move to literatures in the plural. Now, what I overheard at Cambridge was a tiptoeing around that issue. And actually, I was surprised that the Cambridge movement was willing to align itself to the American Black Lives Matter conversation and the South African student movement, but it was unwilling or ignorant about the intellectual production from its former colonies. If we're going to talk about decolonization, you have to begin to recognize methods and outcomes in the production of knowledge locally. You have to engage with that. You cannot continue teaching African history at your African Studies centers purely from the work that your own researchers have done here. There's a body of work that has gone on here that must be recognized, that must be put into your curriculum. Basically, what I'm saying is that point of view is critical in storytelling. But it seems to me that there's a lack of sincerity in this refusal to revise methodology in the West. What makes it worse is Britain's avoidance of the need to return colonial records to their source. Yes, these records relate to the work that the colonizer did in the colonies. And yes, they're about white men and women in Africa, if you like. But since we, the colonized, are the ones who are worked on in more ways than one, I think we deserve to have copies of those records. This is a long overdue conversation. Retaining them in Britain is a power game that sustains the dubious field of Africanist. It erects so-called experts on us, over us. This needs to stop. We must do away with all of these colonial legacies in scholarship. And it's not just the West that needs to write that. Even we here, in terms of how we approach learning and the production of knowledge, we need to change some of these things. I said that we need to dismantle some assumptions that we have, some adherence that we have to Western regimes of knowledge. Think, for example, of the way in which we were taught, and I know that we still teach that way in many of our universities. If you're writing a thesis, you can't use the subjective I voice. It's not reliable. You must distance yourself from the work. But what we are also doing there is we are sacrificing storytelling in preference for theories and methodologies that were developed elsewhere and parachuted on the continent. Now, not all of them are irrelevant, but certainly they are not the only relevant ones. Let us allow other methods of inquiry to come into the conversation on how do you produce knowledge? What are the different parts of a thesis? What voice do you adopt? What methods and protocols account for that knowledge? Now, let me leave the culture of scholarship a little bit and talk about preparing for the return. We talk a lot about repatriation, restitution. Let's talk about preparing for that return. When we talk of restitution and repatriation, I know we steer away from the debate on what we will do with all that is returned because we do not want that debate to water down the original demand for returns. Now, fair enough, But I think that it bears saying that for we who wait to receive these things that were taken from us and those about us in all their tangible and intangible forms, we must prepare to elevate those things wherever possible and to submerge them with what we now have wherever necessary, because culture is not static. Culture leans back to pick what is needed in the present, not to bury itself in purity. When we retrieve, we have 1,000 opportunities to sample, to revise, and to remix as we create anew. This is how restitution will feed our creative sector, not merely by freezing material things in museums and inaccessible physical archives, but by opening them up for reinterpretation to fit into our current contexts in the same way that Alex became Arigisi. Now, I must turn briefly to the pressing need here for us to constantly expand our definition of cultural heritage beyond artifacts, beyond trinkets, animal parts, human remains, pieces taken from our geological features. Our cultural heritage is so much more than that. In discussing the scattering of our past that was occasioned by colonialism, all too often, our staging of our past rests on the indigenous and overlooks the recent past, that which evolved in the colonial years. As we celebrate the kind of creativity made possible by the internet and its accompanying technologies and storing systems, which provide opportunities for our records in the West to finally be shared with us, we must pay attention to our stake in what was made by the preceding technology. So when I talk about return, there are things that must come back to us wholesale. There are things that we can share. They belong to both of us. And actually, technology has been on our side since the emergence of the photocopier. You can just photocopy those records and give us one half and remain with the other half. You don't have to give us back everything, and you certainly don't have to continue retaining everything. Let's share this. It's a shared history. But the other thing I want us to think about is that our scholarship continues to, beyond the scholarship that continues to document us and erect itself as superior of our local regimes of knowledge, let's also think about sound and visual technologies, the audio recordings and the films that were made of us in that colonial era when we had neither the resources nor the skills to make these things about ourselves or for ourselves. When we talk about return our things, we talk about sculptures, for example. We don't talk about films. We don't talk about sound recordings. And I think that we should. Think of the numerous field recordings of Hugh Tracy and others, including songs like Chemirocha, which celebrated and localized the American country singer Jimmy Rogers. Think of the photographs taken and the films shot all over this country, like the 1966 documentary film Africa Addio, or Africa Farewell, which was made by 2 Italian filmmakers. When do our governments ever advocate for the return or the sharing of some of these recordings. If we don't see what is captured on audio and visual film as heritage that we need to revisit, we will remain with a big hole about our past. And if we recognize these cultural productions as part of our heritage, then we must call for better storing of the material at public broadcasters like KBC, and also demand access to what they hold. I'm saying there's a critical chunk of our heritage that exists on film, sound recordings. And I'm saying that we don't have access to it. And I'm saying that our culture will not grow if we don't have access to it. It's not just the knowledge that we need of that era, it's also the ways in which we will use what we get back. We will borrow, we will pick, we will remix, we will sample. And that is how culture grows. And it bears saying again, when the bulk of these images and recordings, just like the official records from colonial offices, are held in places where local scholars and local artists cannot access them, enough to tell our many histories covering the period 1910 to 1980, our national governments and our colonizers keep us from the work of knowledge building about our past. And equally important, I'm saying, they stand in the way of cultural production because that past is a resource for today's creativity. Finally, in our preparation to receive that which was taken, we must erect ways of safeguarding against continued looting. I think we have to say this. What goes on under the guise of research and in the game of tourism is a steady depletion that undermines our cultural heritage and our production of knowledge. Last year, I was actually really horrified when I traveled to Turkana for the first time in a long time to see how that Namortunga, the people of stone, those basalt pillars on the Lodwar Kalokol Road, how steadily they have been depleted over the years. They have actually been dwarfed over time. Now, you know, it bothers me because Namortunga is still a sacred site where some of the people of Turkana pray. If we can't contain this kind, if we can't contain this kind of disrespect for our cultural heritage within our own midst, what hope is there really that we can effectively advocate for and effect the restitution of what was taken 80 or 100 years ago? We continue to lose things in our midst. And I know that Dr. Lagat has just pointed out all of the policies that are being prepared and those which are in the later stages that will help us to protect this. It's really, really urgent work, and it starts with us. We must do better in the work of defining and safeguarding cultural heritage. We sign UNESCO conventions on protecting and promoting our heritage and our arts. And then, sorry, Dr. Lagat, we do shuffle our feet when it comes to creating the policy. I mean, you will admit that the cultural policy, for example, I first heard of it in 1980. It had started in 1979. In my years at the University of Nairobi, it's something that Professor Anjala used to talk about all the time. How long has it taken us to write a cultural policy and effect it? We can't continue shuffling our feet in that way. And I know that even after we write the policy, and after we start working with that policy, our other big problem will be putting in place the mechanisms to ensure compliance. People can't just travel to Turkana, see the lake, enjoy it, and then on their way back to Lodwar to take their flight, pick a stone and put it in their backpack and fly through JKIA. This needs to stop. We have to put an investment in mechanisms to safeguard. Culture will not grow without investment. And it is an investment not just in keeping alive these conditions of neglect and erasure that give us the grief that we sing and sigh about. It is a material investment in protection and production. Producing art, exhibiting it, distributing it, critiquing it, improving it, takes money. That money must come from the state so that we, the audiences for this art, can then do our part in finding the means to consume that art. Thank you.